Hello, fellow humans, and welcome. Today's topic is fairly well researched and generally also well known among both historians and just regular people. Green dresses are pretty infamous for being harmful, and people tend to know about wallpapers as well, but nonetheless, there are at least some lesser known facts that hopefully you didn't know about before the start of this video, so hopefully it's gonna still be interesting. Before we start the video, I have to add a disclaimer that I am not a professional historian by any means, so everything I say in those videos should be taken with a grain of salt. Please check all the sources that I use, they are in the description below, and hope you enjoy! It's easy to assume that arsenic, a highly poisonous element, was just newly discovered, and because it was Victorian era and modern testing methods weren't invented yet, the negative effects were just brushed off while positive effects were praised. But actually no, arsenic not only was known from the 8th century as a very poisonous element, but it also was used in the 19th century as a rat poison, and before that it was used as a murder weapon as well. For example, chances are that Francesco I de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and his wife Bianca Capello were poisoned by arsenic in 1587. And 19th century had a fair share of allegedly arsenic poisonings as well. Sometimes it was jokingly called inheritance powder because people would use it to kill their husbands, wives, parents, etc., just to cash out earlier on their quote-unquote loved ones. Arsenic, also known as arsenic trioxide or white arsenic, is white powder that doesn't have any taste or smell and looks like sugar or flour. It's hard to identify, it's lethal in very small doses, and the symptoms at first are very similar to food poisoning, cholera, and dysentery, all of which were pretty abundant in Victorian era. But how did such a well-known poisonous element end up in dyes and consequentially in dresses, wallpapers, fake flowers, and various other everyday things? And more importantly, why was the quote-unquote epidemic ignored for such a long time? Follow me along on this little journey to find out how candy, green dresses, and fancy wallpapers poisoned Europe, particularly Britain, and also North America for more than half of a century. Before we actually start, first thing that has to be mentioned is that despite the known toxicity of arsenic itself, some of the products containing it were banned as early as 1830s and 40s, the toxicity of the products themselves, such as green dyes known as Paris green and Challis green, weren't such widely known, or at least addressed. The saddest part about this wasn't even the health damage or lost life that was done by the arsenic poisoning, but the sheer amount of ignorance and a lot of times straight up negligence from those in power who could have stopped it way, way, way earlier. Educated people and scientists knew what kind of effects this powder had, and a lot of the politicians and manufacturers who worked with arsenic just outright refused to implement any kinds of regulations that would help to prevent such high amounts of health damage and a lot of times even deaths. The second one is even sadder to acknowledge, because with the first one you can argue that, okay, people just thought that the products weren't toxic, okay, sure. But also, arsenic was just simply very, very profitable. It was a cheap and abundant waste material, and because people really didn't have an alternative to green dyes before, it just became accepted, I guess. But long story short, by the early and mid-19th century, it was virtually everywhere, from medicine to candles to green dyes, last one resulting in clothes, decorations, and what have you being full of the literal poison. Its most infamous use was in wallpapers, which in Victorian era just have became quite fashionable, and rather affordable as well, even for middle-class citizens. And naturally, taking into account the low cost of arsenic itself, the arsenic-containing products quickly rose to popularity, particularly due to how cheap and affordable they were. By the middle of the 19th century, products that contain arsenic were found in many sorts of household items, sometimes even food-related products, and that is if we don't mention the medicine and cosmetics. The active use of it as a household item began with a remedy known as Fowler's solution, created by British doctor Thomas Fowler in 1786, after his quite sensational paper about the medical benefits of arsenic trioxide. I think it's important to remark that arsenic does indeed have some health benefits, for example in treating certain type of leukemia, and minor evidences indeed show that it can be helpful with headaches, food poisoning, and some other stuff, although the latter one lacks sufficient studies and may as well be either placebo or a mere coincidence. So don't quote me on that one, rather don't quote this video whatsoever, I'm not a professional. Anyways, back to Fowler. This solution, containing about 1% of arsenic trioxide, went on to be perceived as a miraculous cure for literally everything one can imagine, from asthma and eczema to dysentery and lymphoma, as well as syphilis, and on top of that was also used as an aphrodisiac by Victorian men. Another common product was medicated arsenic complexion soap, which gave desired luminosity to the user's face by destroying blood cells, and it was hardly the only one. Women ate safe arsenic complexion wafers, which were advertised as a solution for those who desire a transparent, clear, fresh complexion free from blotch, blemish, roughness, coarseness, redness, freckles, or pimples. Usually, those so-called well-being products would be combined together with another product that contained arsenic. As an example, there was a treatment designed by a New York doctor, H.B. Fuld, that combined the aforementioned arsenic complexion wafers with arsenic complexion soap, which was a product of aforementioned Fuld. The overall cost of such treatments usually was pretty low even by today's standards. For example, Fuld's treatment costed less than $1 at the time. You could also find stuff like arsenic pills, manufacturers of which promise their clients complexion like alabaster and roses. A lot of the times, those treatments would specifically be designed for women to improve their skin condition or overall quote-unquote well-being, but by no means men were safe from the stuff too. While it would be an exaggeration to say that everyone munched on arsenic in large quantities every single day, no doubt that this practice was not uncommon at all, which was further encouraged by newspapers that promoted arsenic eating, first in small doses, then in larger. One such article mentioned a man who could eat as much as 4 grams of arsenic, which was more than a lethal dose, as an example of building tolerance via gradually increasing amount of arsenic. However, even though largest scandal concerning arsenic poisonings was yet to happen later in 19th century, as early as 1830s and 40s, doctors started to publish studies regarding threats of ingesting, again, literal poison. More impactful for educating the general, usually less educated and lower income population, however, probably were caricatures. Among them, most notable are John Leech's works, some of which were published in popular magazine Punch. In 1849, he published a caricature criticizing drugstores where arsenic was incredibly easy to use. A child is depicting asking for 1.5 pounds of arsenic, among some laudanum for their mother. For those of us who use a proper measurement system, 1.5 pounds is about 700 grams of pure arsenic. And of course the chemist gladly sells it, the surroundings and other products are absolutely safe and totally suitable for selling to children. Of course, caricature is largely an exaggeration, but for it to exist there has to be a problem to exaggerate it in the first place. And the problem it was because arsenic was indeed incredibly easy to get, and pharmacies usually lacked proper measurements to correctly store arsenic. And this sometimes led to mistakes where arsenic was accidentally sold as other components. This particular situation happened in Bradford in 1858 and led arguably to one of the biggest arsenic poisonings. Interestingly enough, it happened because of adulteration. Adulteration, which meant a secret replacement of actual food components with less costly substitutes, was a little bit more than ubiquitous in Victorian era because it helped to gain some extra profits from selling cheaper products for the price of a real thing. And sadly, it was incredibly common as even businesses which started as honest and contributed to their product safety would eventually be financially forced to use cheaper products because of the concurrence, and one of the Leech caricatures created in 1858 actually concerns the scandal in Bradford, where a number of people, including a lot of children, died or became poisoned because of such negligent attitude. By the time, adulteration of products by arsenic was not practiced on purpose. However, as I already mentioned, lack of proper regulations regarding that stuff and overall negligence by chemists and people who worked with food products eventually led to arsenic occasionally ending up in foods by accident. According to the book Arsenic Century, in October 25, 1858, a sweet shop owner, Joseph Neal, sent his assistant to the neighboring town to get some substance named daft, referring to plaster of Paris, or powder gypsum. Such nicknames were often given to the adulteration products to hide the fact of such quite illegal even back then practice. This substance was usually used by artists to create molds and casts, and in the first place it didn't have to do anything with sweets, except the fact that it was way cheaper than sugar and was constantly mixed with it to cut the costs. About 25–30% of the sugar was replaced by gypsum powder. It already sounds pretty bad, but it gets even worse. The assistant went to the shop of chemist Charles Hodgson, which at the time was sick. And because the doctor was sick, he naturally sent his apprentice to fetch the stuff from the storeroom, and the young man casually weighted 12 pounds of what he thought was daft. The problem was that this daft was a white powder, as Paris plaster should be, but it wasn't the only white powder in the room. Hodgson failed to warn the apprentice about that, as well as to properly label stuff in the storeroom, and as you can guess, the said daft was actually arsenic, which was labeled only at the bottom of the cask. Now, there was actually Sale of Arsenic Regulation Act put in place in 1851, and it contained an attempt to regulate both selling of arsenic, as arsenic should be only sold to people who drugstore worker knew personally or with a witness personally known to the seller, and also that arsenic should be sold only to people of age. Fun fact of living in the Victorian era, I guess. But also, it pertained to issues of storing arsenic as well. The fact that this act existed for about 7 years at this point really shows how inefficient those regulations actually were. The third paragraph of the aforementioned act states,
"No person shall sell any arsenic unless the same be before the sale thereof mixed with soot or indigo in the proportion of 1 ounce of soot or half an ounce of indigo and the least to 1 pound of arsenic, and so in proportion for any greater or less quantity, provided always that there is such arsenic is stated by the purchaser to be required, not for use in agriculture, but for some other purposes for which such admixtures would, according to the representation of the purchaser, render it unfit, such arsenic may be sold without such admixture in a quantity of not less than 10 pounds at any time."
Basically, it means that arsenic should be colored or mixed with indigo, so it would be noticeable and understandable what kind of substance this is. Unless the situation is an exception and requires pure stuff without. So, great stuff, isn't it? The only problem, it basically didn't work, like, whatsoever. The regulations were on paper, sure, but sellers never colored arsenic to store it, as the act didn't even mention storing, and even when it came to selling, not everybody implemented those methods. I would even go as far to call them recommendations, because really, that's what they were. With no forces to make sellers implement those, of course nobody would voluntarily waste their time and products on such methods. Of course, I'm not an idiot. I know which white powers which. Now I shall sell 12 pounds of non-edible stuff to my client so he can make tasty sweets. Which casket out of those 15s contained that dead bat wings? Probably a drugstore seller somewhere in mid-1850s. Anyway, so the Neal's assistant gets arsenic instead of powdered gypsum, and delivers to the candy maker 5.4 kilograms of arsenic. And literally nobody, including Neal's supposedly very experienced employee, were concerned by the different, more coarser and denser texture of the powder until the sweets were done. The employee, James Appleton, then addressed that the product looked different than usual. He himself got arsenic poisoning and suffered such symptoms as vomiting, nausea, and pains in his limbs, but he didn't realize that was arsenic poisoning. Apparently, Neal even joked about the employee adding cayenne pepper instead of sugar. Nice! Yet another instance of negligence was Neal's observations of unusually long time that candies took to dry, and that they were darker than usual, which he proceeded to ignore. When 18 kilos, or 40 pounds of humbugs, as the sweets were called, were delivered to vendor William Hedicker, he had received a hefty discount of half a penny for the sweet for discoloration. But later he himself also would become sick after testing the product on October the 30th. Nonetheless, $20 or 20 pounds, I guess, are 20 pounds. So he also decided that it's totally fine and proceeded to sell them, even though he became so ill he had to ask his friends to take over the stall. Approximately 1,000 of sweets were sold before the stall closed for the night. Consequences already became obvious next day. By Sunday morning, 2 boys have already died, and in the course of Halloween more have perished. And it was determined by the police that all victims have taken sweets, and citizens were informed not to buy any sweets. By mid-Monday, another dozen had perished, and 78 people were seriously sick, and that was only in Bradford. The amount of cases was so massive that the reporters claimed it was impossible to keep a catalog, deeming the episode as a horrible story of a whole slaughter that had transformed many cheerful homes into the scenes of sudden and inconsolable sorrow. Police then quickly confiscated the sweets and arrested Neil, who apparently attempted to escape but failed, and then the remaining sweets were seized. Neil then was taken into custody alongside with the chemist and his apprentice. The sweets were tested and the results showed as much as 15 grams per piece. All 3 were charged with manslaughter charges. The public was understandably mad, and numerous magazines and newspapers, etc., produced some sort of content relating to the tragedy, including Punch and aforementioned cartoon by Leach called The Great Lasagne Maker. However, despite all the negligence and quite literal violation of the law, may I remind you, adding gypsum wasn't really good for anyone's health in the first place either, none of the 3 were actually charged guilty. Even the chemist, who should have kept arsenic away and then color it as he was selling it, at least he should have warned the apprentice about the arsenic being present in the room. However, the situation was deemed as an unfortunate accident. Totally no violation here, folks. Obviously, public and press were outraged because, if anything, there should have been some sort of punishment for the intent of adulteration. And quite righteously, people were rather angry that there was no law prohibiting such practice. The problem of adulteration was entering the public's eye even before Bradford, and while it was arguably the worst instance, it was, after all, nothing new. From 1854 to 1857, Dr. Arthur Hell-Hassel had published several works regarding food adulteration. He was interested in it since late 40s, and his lectures on the subject brought him to the attention of Lancet's editor, Lancet being the biggest and well-known medical magazine at the time. His 1854 study was the first where sweets and confectionery was mentioned, and given the publicity of his works and the authority that he and the Lancet magazine already had, the issue of adulteration started to bother regular people who were understandably anxious and outraged by the extensive list of poison that merchants and food makers would constantly put in their food for the sake of cheapskating. He provides a very nice list of what you could find in various food products, such joys as lead, copper, mercury, and, of course, arsenic. Just take a look at the list of almost 100 candies that were analyzed in Lancet's 1855 study, Food and Its Adulteration. Almost every single one of them contains some ingredients that definitely should not be there, and list of poisons is concerning, to say the least. It gives a little bit of insight of how long adulteration has been a very well-known problem. As early as 1833, Dr. Shaughnessy published a paper concerning adulteration in confectionery in Lancet, and a paragraph from it was cited in Hassel's paper later. Nonetheless, government didn't respond to any of the scientists' concerns, and it allowed for such tragedies as Bradford incident to happen. Even then, it took massive public outrage for anything to be done whatsoever, but at least in the 1860s, the Bill of Adulterations of Food and Drink was finally passed as a law. But despite everything, it was still very largely ineffective, both because it was quite vague, and because the penalty for violating it was £5. And in 1862, 3 more kids died and 2 became sick because of sweets. Nonetheless, some success in the regulation of arsenic was finally achieved in 1875, in the Sale of Food and Drink Act. It finally introduced somewhat effective measurements in regard to adulteration for food. However, you may have noticed that the act passed a year before the study. But it still mentioned arsenic. And it is because arsenic was infamously used for coloring. Most infamously in the green dye, but not also. and those dyes weren't accounted for a very long time, so they were continued to be used in sweets for coloration purposes. Anyhow, moving on, I think now it's the time to talk about color green. Mainly, there were two green pigments known for the use of arsenic, Paris green and Challis green, which used to produce a very vibrant green that was matched by no other ingredient. See, prior to late 1700s, green had to be made from expensive minerals in a quite complicated process, mostly malachite and verdigris, and I cannot even begin to comprehend how much of a hassle green color was to deal with for artists, especially if they painted with oil. Slight tangent incoming. See, the painting nowadays is way less stressful due to large availability of synthetic pigments, which are less prone to become yellow or black or brown when interacting with other components and pigments. But that is recent development. Not only pigments themselves usually contain some chemical elements which had to be applied only in a certain way without mixing it with other colors, or God forbid anything in the atmosphere, the available green was also dull and had a tendency to become more yellow. This is why in Renaissance painting you don't see as much green as much as you see yellows, reds, and other vibrant colors. It was simply not available, and over time it would deteriorate, appearing more brownish or yellowish. Anyhow, similar can be said about design and fashion. Greens were quite a hassle, and the results weren't even that pretty. They were usually dull and, again, brownish. So, when a new, better, and more vibrant green dye appeared, naturally it quickly became popular with the artists and designers alike. The first time a pigment containing an element called copper arsenite was created in 1778 by Challis, and was called Challis green. Being more vibrant and much more durable, it quickly replaced the other greens without any match for it, up until 1814, when another arsenic element, copper acetoarsenite, was used to produce yet another hue of green, more vibrant than ever, outmatching even the Challis green. First of them was called Schweinfurt green because it was produced there, but it quickly stopped being the only one because different methods result in different hues. The book called The Arsenic Century mentions as many as 50 shades. Imagine that movie, but it's Victorian era and everything they wear, see, or use contains arsenic, and all the characters die from poisoning in the end. The story I would definitely watch. Anyhow, there was Paris green, Vienna green, emerald green, and many, many, many others. So imagine you have about 700 tons of arsenic mine waste, and sadly you cannot make it all into rat poison, and then on top of that you add a desire for bright, vibrant color that conveniently can be made from aforementioned waste, and also mix in a growing middle class which would be interested in purchase pretty stuff for various endeavors. You can guess why it became so popular and widely available. Initially, arsenic greens were used for walls and for furniture that needed sprucing up. Naturally, the wall paint would then with time flake off, and there were many instances of children being poisoned by putting the flakes in their mouth. And even eating it wasn't necessary. Naturally, walls would just dust off, and inhabitants could now inhale this deadly substance. Despite known health hazards, green was used for virtually anything: furniture, decorative stuff, warpings, clothes, children's toys, and so on and so forth. One instance of this being dresses. Green fabric for ball gowns was particularly loaded with arsenic, and green ball dress contained so much of the stuff that a woman who decided to be fancy and wear a gorgeous green dress, quote-unquote, carries in her skirts poison enough to slay the whole of the admirers she may met within half a dozen ballrooms. She was, one may say, drop-dead gorgeous. Anyways, explains a certain trend or stereotype that women were very physically weak and prone to fainting. No shit, literally everything they encountered was somewhat poisonous. I can't even understand how they could survive such long in those conditions. The women of lower classes who couldn't afford ball gowns were affected as well, though. Even cheaper fabric was dyed using arsenic in the same quantities. Again, as with the adulteration, it wasn't news for anyone, and some attempts to fight the usage of arsenic, or at least to try and reduce harm, were made, as for example Henry Lefebvre developed a simple test that could detect presence of arsenic in the clothes. A drop of ammonia that was applied to the fabric, which turned blue if the fabric contained copper, which almost exclusively at that point in time was used together with arsenic. Nonetheless, arsenic was present in hats, socks, shirts, pants, etc., and there were known cases of people turning disabled from walking in such socks and stockings. Even leaves and fake flowers that were used as accessories and decorations for hats and clothes contained so much green powder that it killed a girl in 1862 who put some fake grapes that were colored with Chilean's green in her mouth. The most infamous event in regards of arsenic poisonings, which also brought it to the minds of general populations, was arguably the death of a young 18-year-old Matilda Schuer, who was employed as a florist and worked with artificial flowers. She was one of many young girls aged from 8 to 20 who had to cut leaves and other plant imitations from green soft cotton fabric called muslin, and then color it by first dipping the fabric in wax, and then adding the color itself, either by dusting it with Chile's green powder, or by kneading the solution of green powder into the material. One can only imagine the conditions in which these women had to work. Their eyes and skin would constantly be exposed to dust containing green pigment, the employers provide no protection, air wasn't ventilated, so the girls would constantly be inhaling the green dust for all the working day, which was from 14 to 16 hours long depending on the season. The effects of the arsenic has been a concern though. An 1859 survey by Anne-Gabrielle Maxine Verroy concluded that mostly female workers who made artificial flowers into bouquets in French workshops were experiencing nausea, colic and diarrhea, anemia, pallor, and constant headaches that made them feel as their temples being pressed in a vice. The survey even led to legislation being passed in both Germany and France that improved the conditions for those workers. The Great Britain, however, didn't have such, and unsurprisingly most of the workers usually would become ill within days of working with such decorations. Matilda Schuer was no exception. Soon she felt pain in her stomach and had such symptoms as vomiting and nausea. The junctions of her stomach were green, which was a physical indication of the amount of powder she unintentionally consumed while working by accidentally inhaling it. In November of 1861, her condition became so bad that her mother had to administer her to a physician, but it had zero positive impact, and sadly she endured the death of great agony. She spent her last hour with convulsions every couple of minutes, and she said that everything she looked at was green. The autopsy determined that the cause of death was poisoning by arsenic copyright. And as with arsenic in food and the issue of adulteration, the awful conditions of lower-class workers were known to at least some physicians. More than a year before, already mentioned Dr. Hassel Hill has been concerned by Chile's green and the conditions of workers who had to constantly interact with it, describing their situation as rich to the extreme, as well as describing constant signs of arsenic poisonings, such as sores on the body parts that were exposed to the powder dust, as well as many other quite gruesome symptoms that made the employees to leave the work from time to time. Then symptoms would go away, that is, if they weren't poisoned by green furniture or wallpapers at home, and then after returning to work the symptoms would come back. Some employers would then introduce facial masks, but they were too uncomfortable and obstructed breathing. Without properly educating workers on why such measurements are necessary, nobody really wore them. At best, women would cover their faces with cotton fabric, which hardly helped, and even could make the situation even worse if the fabric was green and contained arsenic pigment. Of course, there were numerous attempts to raise awareness about the health hazards of green clothing, until this cause was reported in the London Evening Standard in 1863, alongside advice to avoid green dresses at all costs. Unfortunately, despite the numbers of similar stories, green clothing and accessories remained very demanded at the fashion market. Even a lot of physicians ignored the drastic situation because of commercial interests. As with the adulteration and selling of arsenic earlier, the fight for regulation of arsenic was really hard and quite long as well. As the author of the book Arsenic Century puts it, at the time Britain was such a gloriously free country that anything was allowed, even to the slow poisonings of the little ones. Even Matilda's death, while acknowledged as arsenic poisoning, was regarded as a mere accident. The attitude towards the problem is well represented in the William Guy's report. In his opinion, measurements against arsenic poisonings would be so detrimental to the economy of England that it won't be able to compete with other countries in the international market, despite the fact that, as example, Germany or France had laws that regulated both consumption and manufacture of arsenic-containing products. He also stated lower classes would not benefit from the protection much as their habits weren't cleanly, and if not for arsenic, then something else would get them anyway. This was a very enraging read, by the way. Exception was made only for children below 18, who, in Guy's opinion, should not be working with arsenic. Honestly, I would like to joke about it, but like, it actually was quite a win at the time, I suppose. And such simple statement generally explains, in my opinion, the whole situation. Generally, it was simply allowed by rich people and government, who, while yes, did suffer from the situation too, but never to the extent as working class did. Green in dresses, fabrics, and accessories weren't prohibited on the state level until much later, because Guy's report suggested no interference for economical reasons, leaving quote-unquote the decision on the topic for the public instead. Instead, the interest in green clothes kinda naturally faded away of fashion on its own, likely due to multiple factors. Like I mentioned, awareness was being spread with different levels of success. Some attempts, in my opinion, nonetheless are worth mentioning. For example, Ladies' Sanitary Organization that played at least some role in the decline of the fashion for the green stuff. Founded in 1857, this organization had the quite noble mission of both educating women on their own health and the health of their families, as well as inspiring women to improve social and economical conditions of others, specifically those conditions that could lead to illness. Of course, before the green dye could be made, you would have to get the arsenic itself, and one can only imagine the conditions for mine workers. The rocks would be blasted or drilled, releasing the poisonous dust in the air. The waste sometimes also poisoned local water supplies and crops by getting in the soil, and the deaths would usually be attributed to diphtheria, cholera, or virtually any of the quite abundant diseases at the time. By 1870s, more than half of the world arsenic supplies came only from a few mines, and one of the owners was William Morris. He is incredibly well known and also loved by art historians for being against mass production for the sake of preserving skills, which were quote-unquote becoming obsolete because of the Industrial Revolution. He also advocated for good working conditions and fair wages for the employees. This person kinda deserves his own video, both because of the good and the bad stuff he was known for, but we shall concentrate only on the arsenic, because otherwise I will digress too much, and this video would be like 9 hours long. So anyways, most of his family wealth actually came from one of, if not the, biggest arsenic suppliers, Devon Great Consols, a share of which Morris inherited from his father. He died when William Morris was a kid, but even then it was enough to fund his education and his early business ventures, including Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co. in 1861, which later would be responsible for designing furniture, wallpapers, and various other stuff. 10 years later, Morris also became the director of Devon, and in the letter to his mother in 1872, he mentioned a new contract for arsenic at a good price. Lucinda Hawksley asks an interesting question in her book, Bitten by Witch Fever, why Morris, who was supposedly so concerned about his workers' condition, never himself visited the mines or even was concerned about the well-being of the miners and their families. He was most likely acquaintance with those because in the 1860s his company became a subject of investigation, specifically due to reported poor working conditions. His uncle Thomas Morris basically admitted that boys as young as 10 years old were sent down the mines, and girls as young as 8 were employed to sort through the refuse heaps, which included arsenic. In his later conversation with Wilfred Scaven Blunt that was published in 1896, Morris said that he sold his shares. However, despite his wordings in this conversation, as historians know, he did not sell them immediately after inheriting them, and he did so only when copper mining weren't as profitable anymore. Here's a quote from that interview. "We had some mining shares in Cornwall, and when I succeeded them, I sold them. My relations thought me both wicked and mad, but shares are worth nothing now." End of the quote. Some of the wonders of working for this arsenic corporation included direct exposure to arsenic, and while there were masks and overalls to prevent it, the use of it was limited, and the effects of such exposure included fingernails turning yellow or greenish, as well as uncurated lesions also known as pox opening on the hands, which could get worse if any skin damage was already present. And if my hands are full of tiny scratches and bruises all the time, I desperately do not want to imagine what happened with the miners. And as we started to speak about Morris, I think it's only natural to move on to the most infamous instance of arsenic use, the wallpapers. By the 19th century, wallpapers have already been known for about 3 centuries. But the Industrial Revolution generally made the process of wallpaper making somewhat automated and way cheaper, and now way more households could afford them. Combined with the newly discovered bright green color, and frankly, not only the green, other colors contained arsenic as well, it's understandable why they became very popular. Even before Shelley's green came into Great Britain, however, many have voiced their concern with use of arsenic, starting with German chemist Leopold Gmelin, who suggested a ban on those in 1839, and ending with Carl William Shelley himself. But Britain ignored all of those for the sake of profit. During the same period as everything green was becoming more and more popular, gas lamps became widely available, which provided a better light and thus a better opportunity to enjoy the bright colors that have just emerged. In early Georgian and Regency Britain, wallpapers and just color palette of the interior design generally tended to be pale and similar in tones, but the fashion had gradually changed. In 1845, David Ramsay Hay has produced a color theory that introduced new ways of color harmony, a nomenclature of colors, hues, tints, and shades, applicable to the arts and natural sciences, to manufacturers, and other purposes of general utility. And it introduced color combinations based on aesthetics rather than on being close on the color circle, which was the way prior to that. Both of the aforementioned things probably played their role, but the most important factor was industrialization of the process and invention of all sorts of machines that drastically sped up the process, particularly machine printing, which was invented in 1840, and a tax repeal on printed paper, which was introduced a couple of years prior to that. In the first half of the 19th century, England saw a growing interest in French wallpapers, most of which were hand-painted with majestic landscapes, architectures, etc., and looked absolutely beautiful, but also unsurprisingly costed a lot. Fun fact, White House is decorated by one of them, Scenes of North America by Zuber and C, designed in 1845. The end of fun fact. British wallpapers at the time, with all their variety, were considered inferior, even though antique, Gothic, and Renaissance-inspired designs were more or less popular with general public. So, in 1837, British government decided to intervene, financed a bunch of schools to train the designers, and encouraged exhibitions which would teach the mysteries of good taste, with limited success for the next couple of decades. Things changed in the mid-19th century, particularly due to a campaign against overly lavish and complicated Rococo-ish designs led by painter Richard Redgrave, designer Owen Jones, and civil servant Henry Cole. Their wallpapers consisted of more geometric as well as abstract shapes like stars or triangles, and some of them, particularly designed by Jones, were inspired by Islamic art and had sort of ornamentalist vibe to it. Art Nouveau was also becoming more and more popular with its angular shapes combined with flowers, and soon arts and crafts movement was born. At last, in 1862, British wallpapers won most of the prizes during the international exhibition, further humiliating the French at the Exposition Universale in 1867. So you might ask how this lackluster information, an incoherent, poorly structured mess about innovations, colored theory, and changing taste in wallpaper has to do with our topic. Well, in my opinion, it helps to understand why the new wallpapers with ornaments and flower patterns and whatnot became so popular, and why consequentially they ended up in so many households, causing poisoning and sometimes even deaths. Realistically though, I'm just a nerd who likes art history. Moving on. It would be an absolute crime not to mention the arts and crafts movement when it comes to wallpapers. Their whole thing was the opposition to the industrialization and modern technology, and they largely took their inspiration from the medieval period. Quite a few designers were involved in it, but no one stands out more than William Morris does. His first company, Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co., was almost instantly successful. Their medieval-inspired designs were extremely popular. He designed most of the company's tapestries as well as 41 of the wallpapers. His works were so successful that his name became synonymous with wallpapers. And of course it contained arsenic because he inherited a mind that literally produced the stuff. And he believed that because of the wallpaper making methods, arsenic just somehow dissolved and wasn't poisonous anymore, even though the pigments containing arsenic were known to be harmful, because even the creator of Shelley's green himself stated so. But anyways, considering that he inherited his father's highly profitable arsenic mine, that were great consoles, is it really a surprise that almost all of the wallpapers that his company produced contained arsenic? And his designs were incredibly famous, and frankly most of them were indeed quite beautiful. A couple of the most popular examples are daisy, fruit, trellis, scroll, Venetian, and large-curve patterns. In 1874, he proceeded to dissolve his company, and next year established a new company which allowed him sole ownership over manufacturing and stuff. Then he also sold Devon, and 2 years later sold his shares. At this point, Morris began to pay more attention to dyeing methods, suggesting vegetable dyes as in the good old days to achieve less crude colors. In 1881, due to advances in weaving, dyeing, and cotton printing techniques, Morris was able to move his workshop to Merton Abbey Mills, a medieval abbey and a 19th century factory, which was great because it was more spacious and allowed for better conditions to his workers. There, he repurposed some of the old building for weaving factory, dye house, a shop, etc. Morris' work easily contributed to an already growing interest in wallpapers. It was fashionable to put them over old oak panels and decorate separate or even the same room with numbers of different tapestry patterns. If someone decided that they are tired of their current wallpapers and wanted a new one, they would simply put it on top of the old one. In 1883, a book called Our Homes and How to Make Them Healthy advised against this practice though. But not particularly because of harmful elements that dyes might contain, but rather because the stacks of the layers could easily rot due to the moisture and in general were absorbing all kind of harmful elements. Interestingly, he also heavily advised against putting wallpapers in bedrooms because their monotonic patterns could be torturous to the people trying to sleep. Like, dude, you got so close. The arsenic wallpapers, at least some of them, deteriorated rather quickly. Green dust would simply flake off and end up on the floor and in the air in a matter of weeks. One of such reports comes from a political activist named Harriet Martineau, but back then nobody really thought about the exact implications that this fact had. Rather, people complained that it was expensive to replace their wallpapers every year or so. Arsenic was just briefly mentioned as if it wasn't a big deal. There are many horror stories about somebody being poisoned by arsenic due to wallpapers. Of course, not just Morris designs wallpapers, all kinds of manufacturers were guilty of this practice, but he just was one of the most noticeable. The fact that arsenic is only in green dyes is hilariously enough a little myth that comes from one of such stories. In 1858, a Professor William Hinn submitted his article concerning an experience that he had after redecorating his studio with green wallpapers in 1850. In his words, quote-unquote, Great Britain is experiencing a great deal of slow poisoning, end of the quote. Dr. Hinz experienced nausea, abdominal pain, and lightheadedness within the first couple of hours he spent at the newly decorated studio. For several years, he kept coming back to the same studio and he kept having those same symptoms until he finally realized that maybe it's not a coincidence that he experienced safe symptoms only in that particular room. After analyzing some dust that flaked off the wallpaper, he removed them because of his discovery of arsenic. However, he mistakenly thought that he had some sort of unique reaction, an allergy perhaps. That was until 1856 when he heard about a very similar experience from a businessman and his wife. They both had sore throat, eye inflammation, as well as nausea and headaches, which miraculously went away after a vacation at the seaside away from home, only for symptoms to return when they came back home. Surely enough, their health actually improved after removal of a bright green wallpaper. After the publication, newspapers quickly picked up the story, and for whatever reason some of them wrongly believed that it's just the green wallpapers. In reality, almost any color could contain arsenic, and sometimes other colors would contain more than the stereotypical green ones. According to the article Arsenic-Handled Wallpapers by Joe Banham, they also enhanced other shades, including blues, reds, mauves, pinks, yellows, browns, and greys. In 1858, one manufacturer estimated that 100 million square miles of arsenic-colored papers were to be found on the walls of British homes, prompting the chemist, Alfred Taylor, to declare that wallpaper now furnishes arsenic to the millions. Nonetheless, this particular publication was a part of trends of sorts. Newspapers and science magazines alike started to tell more and more similar stories or create new studies, and soon the academic world saw a rise in concern against the use of arsenic. Not the general public, though. Partially because this concern faced at least some opposition, largely from wallpaper businesses. The owners used the very same tactic that, for example, would be used by tobacco companies in the 60s. They claimed that the products are safe, and that they themselves have rooms furnished with lavish green wallpapers, and that they are perfectly fine. But manufacturers are obviously very highly biased. Nonetheless, the picture was not as simple for the scientific community back then. As an example, Dr. Arthur Hassel-Hill, the very same one who was known for writing papers on adulteration and its harm, stated that arsenic possessed most harm when it was ingested with foods and medicine, and that arsenic-containing furniture, wallpapers, etc. wasn't as dangerous. And he was hardly the only one in scientific community who didn't blame arsenic for the symptoms that people were experiencing. After all, 19th century Britain was rife with cholera, dysentery, and a number of other diseases with similar symptoms. And as for the case of Dr. Hinge, he experienced symptoms such as headaches, lightheadedness, etc. after hours of work, so that could be explained simply with overworking. Sadly, this belief was rather common and probably killed or substantially damaged health for a lot of people because false diagnosis meant confinement to their bedroom. And you can guess that it wasn't going to be beneficial for their health if their bedroom was furnished with the same wallpaper as well. It was later discovered that arsenic, contrary to beliefs in the 19th century, pretty much could become a part of the air itself, sort of becoming a poisonous vapor. It's not really a vapor, I guess. I'm not a chemist, sorry. And it's exactly this air that was largely to blame instead of just the dust and the flakes that were main suspects from 1850s to 1890s. Nonetheless, in that exact time, scientific community gradually shifted more and more towards a consensus in regard of arsenic's harmful nature. You see, before, as I just mentioned, most harm was seen in chewing or ingesting arsenic. It was a real and valid concern when it comes to children who are quite prone to putting stuff in their mouths, but adults generally don't really eat or chew everything they see, unless you have pico or something, but come on, it's 19th century and you would be just described as hysterical and prescribed arsenic pills. Yay! Generally, by 1860s, more empirical evidence was collected and published. There are numbers of stories that are identical to Dr. Hinge's experience. You get sick, you leave the room and get better, you return and get sick again, you take off wallpapers, boom, you're fine again. These stories were so ubiquitous that no house, however grand, was immune to danger. Even the Queen's Buckingham Palace allegedly had a poisonous wallpaper, which was removed in 1879 after a visiting dignitary complained of sickness following a night in an arsenically decorated bedroom. However, as expected, in the 1860s, the public was way less prone to immediately react to the imminent threat than the scientific community was. What helped, though, was work of fiction. For example, cartoons such as British Punch or American Puck frequently satirized the public's carelessness and lack of awareness, which, by the way, was a great way to simultaneously inform large amounts of people, as well as attract the attention of politicians who were ready to jump out of their pants just so these comics wouldn't portray them negatively. There were also novels, for example, a rather dramatic The Green of the Period or The Unsuspected Foe in the Englishman's House. In the 1870s, a couple of influential medical papers finally resulted in the widespread fear of arsenic, and several calls to outlaw the practice of using it in dyes, wallpapers, and other household items. For example, the paper by R.C. Kedzie, a member from the Michigan State Board of Health, published a very condensed and yet effective paper which consists of explanation how arsenic is impacting our health or getting inside our organs, as well as people's stories, recommendations, methods of testing if something has arsenic in it, etc., etc. In the Great Britain, Times was publishing multiple articles as well. One of them even stated that Devon Great Council alone was producing enough arsenic to poison the world. Morris himself, by the way, for a very long time still remained skeptical towards arsenic poisonings, basically ignoring a lot of recorded cases of poisonings by his company's products. But luckily, gradually public pressure continued to increase. London's health department also began to lobby arsenic-free manufacturers, which at first was difficult, but as more people were willing to buy stuff that wouldn't literally kill you, it became more profitable, and so more and more artists and manufacturers were willing to produce items with less harmful ingredients. Huge impact was also made by an Italian scientist, Bartolomeo Gusio. In 1891, he found out evidence that damp conditions could lead to arsenic kinda evaporating, thus actually creating a poisonous gas, because before it was believed that arsenic could not evaporate. And even with all this evidence, it was mainly public pressure that led to the decline in use of arsenic. And in the early 1900s, Britain was pronounced to be mostly arsenic-free. After nearly 100 years, the poison finally disappeared from day-to-day usage. And that's mostly it for today's video. In conclusion, I want to say a couple things. First of all, it was incredibly interesting, but also kinda difficult to make this video because I had zero experience with such relatively long content prior to that. I don't think I structured this video particularly well, or delivered the information in a particularly compelling way, but I still hope that you either learned something new or just had a good time watching this incoherent rant. Nonetheless, it was incredibly interesting to learn all these historical facts and kinda look at how they translate onto today's world, because essentially, not a lot of things actually have changed compared to back then, even though we tend to say that people were really stupid. I really don't think it's the case. This topic is incredibly massive, and there's many books written in regards of arsenic and how it was used. In case if anything seemed interesting to you and you would like to know more, or simply check information, because again, I'm not an expert, so I probably made at least a couple of mistakes. All the sources are in the description, and nothing in this video by any means was kinda, you know, my own. I mostly cited the books and the articles. So that's about it for today's video. Thank you so much, and if you're still here, maybe you should consider liking and subscribing, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!